around and around it goes. Where it stops is my next color. As part of the Demons releases for one-page rules Demons Factions, I've been doing videos all about swapping the traditional color schemes of these demons. War demons become Change, Change becomes Plague. Well, this month is my last two swaps, Lust and Plague together. So I'll be using a Plague Fury and a Lust Warrior for this little challenge, since they have the most similar body types from this month. The challenge is pretty simple. It's a color wheel relay. I start with a color, and then to do the other model's next color, I'll flip the color wheel 180 and use that color. Then I'll pick a color that I think goes with it, flip the wheel 180 again to go back to the other model. In theory, as long as I use the right starting color, I should end up with one looking more Plague and the other more Lust. I've got to start with an absolute, and I think there's no way I can make this snake lady look like Plague without a muddy green to start. So that's my first picked color. I'll use some burnt umber, phthalo green, white, and black to get myself a dark and saturated base coat color. I'll be using this on her scales along the snake body, but to add a bit of interest among the scales, I'll also add some yellow oxide to the mix and pick out a few scales with this new offset color. To give me my first highlight, I'm going to mix some green into the white, just so it's not a pure white going into my mix. Then mix this with the base color. I'll use my brush to layer it on, but try and give it some texture by just following the grain of the scales with thin lines. For the off color, I do the same thing, but add a bit more of the yellow to go with the green I had in the white. For the follow-up highlight, just using more of the white and green mix to make my base mix brighter again. But also I'll be adding some medium just to dilute out the pigments a bit, so it doesn't dry too opaque, which can happen with white. I'll also try and keep this layer more towards the highest points, so the upper parts of the scales, and leaving anything that's the least visible from above without this layer. And just to get a little more shade into the shades I was talking about, I'm going to add some more brown to the base green and do a simple wash and or glaze in those shadows, just to change the color a bit. With the green out of the way, it's going to force my hand for the Lusty Plague model, and it actually seems like quite a fitting one because the opposite of yellow-green, which I got by adding the brown oxide, is a magenta. So if I just turn everything around, I've replaced the green with magenta and I should be good to go. Now the true opposite of green is red, and I didn't add much to the green to push it into yellow-green, so I think it's only fair that I push this magenta more towards red, which you would do by adding yellow to it. Then the brown again to darken, and the black and white to desaturate. Now he's got a pretty huge wingspan, and I've got a tiny brush. That's a no from me, dog. So it gets loaded into the airbrush instead to be sprayed on, pretty much covering the whole model in it. Now, I altered the color of some of the scales a bit, so I think it's only fair we alter some of his flesh color as well. So I'm adding more of the yellow into the magenta, getting a more orange version of a magenta, and loading that into the airbrush once again. I'm going to feather this color along the wings towards the tip, so that's where one of the variations is going to be. But I feel like his tail, being as huge as it is, also needs some of that variance. So get about half of the tail with this color too. For the highlights, it'll be the same process as the green, adding the magenta to some white and using that to lighten the base mix. This guy was way more sculpted in texture, and so it should be easy to follow along with the grain on him as well. For the transition sections though, I'll add a little bit more yellow and do a layering with that, kind of where they're in between. Then follow up with a bit more yellow into the mix to get the layering on the extreme edges. That way I can keep some of that transition between colors in there. I did one more layer of highlights, but at this point I was already starting to doubt the validity of the challenge. He's just way too pink when the opposite of the green I have should be more towards red than a full-on magenta. So I added some Naphthol Crimson to my airbrush, just a brush tip full, and I give him a spray tan. Crimson is a cold red, so should still keep things on the magenta side, but give me that missing red hue that it was supposed to go with it. Just like I gave the Snake Lady a bit of a hue shift, I wanted to give his shadow some of that action as well, By going brown on hers, it meant that I had to go the same but opposite direction with his. And the opposite of brown, which is an orange, is blue. So I added some of my ultramarine blue, which is a warm blue, to my airbrush the same way I did the red and sprayed some into his shadows. So for my choice color on the flying mushroom, I think right now he looks a bit like a rose. So why not some yellow leather to complete that color match? So I have a raw umber and raw sienna on my palette with white and black, and I make a 50-50 mix of the umbers, just adding a bit of the white and black for opacity. You may not look it at first, but this guy has a lot of leather strappage going on, so this should be pretty visible towards the end. For now though, just getting a solid base coat with my refined umber. I want to separate out these straps a little bit more, so to that end I make a little wash out of raw umber and black and medium and get it in all the folds, but also along the rims of all the parts to give me a bit of an outline to them. Not quite a black line, but some separation. To give the leather some highlights, I'm heading right on up to yellow oxide, but mixing it with a bit of the raw sienna and some medium to dilute. I want to get the raised edges of all the leather straps this time around, being careful with the small strokes and using the edge of the brush where I can. For a final highlight, I'm just going to use some of the yellow oxide and a tiny amount of the white. This will be a bit of a stipple along the most visible edges, adding texture into the highlights already kind of there. When I spin the color wheel this time, it goes from yellow to purple, which I think I can make work. But a pure purple might look a little too lush still, and these are supposed to be plague colors. So I'm just going to push the purple away from pure with some green, which oddly enough makes it kind of blue. Weird that two secondaries actually mix towards a primary. But I added a lot of the white because this is just going to be for a skin, so I figure I'll go pale with it. So start off pretty light with it still, though this will darken some as it dries. And the magic of white makes it opaque, so it doesn't take much to get a nice base layer. I want to take care of some early shadows around the armor first, before I do too much I could ruin. So mix up a wash from the green and purple and some medium, but I only spread it out around the edges of the armor. Kind of like a really lazy black line, but without the black or the line. Then to make up for what I just did, I'm going to rebase some of the muscle definition in the same base color from before, just correcting any really egregious mistakes or break lines. To continue with my highlighting, I'm just going to add a bit of white to lighten the mix a bit with some more medium as well. With this layer, I'll pick out the roundness of the muscles. This isn't really following the light sources, but instead just picking out all the tops of the domes. It'll look a bit obvious where the lines are, but I'm going to fix that right now. With some more white into the mix, and just a brush tip of that mix goes into my airbrush with some medium. Keeping my angle in relation to the model high, I'll spray very gently until a light pale coating covers her light pale skin. I asked on my Discord what her armor color should be to remain plague-like, and the decision was an almost unanimous yellow, but a sickly yellow. So my base layer is just going to be a neutral yellow and carbon black, since the black has a blue tint, which makes the yellow sickly. The black should at least make it pretty easy to apply this base coat, but I'll take it slow just because it's a lot of little parts to this armor. When I made my first mix, I kind of accidentally made my next mix at the same time, because I needed way more black than I thought, but I didn't want to mess it up, so did it to the side. Now I just got my lighter black and yellow all ready to go. Her parts are really tiny here, and well, I don't have the dexterity for that, so I'm going to focus instead on the larger picture and block in the highlight as though these were flat, solid pieces. The only place I'm going to make an exception is on the sides. I think I can leave a lot of the shadows alone by only using the side of my brush. For the pure yellow layer, I'm going to keep a little bit of the black in it to make sure it's on the gross side of yellow, but also not add too much medium, because I need this a bit thicker, because I plan to use the edge of my brush mainly to layer this on the sharp edges, and in highlight points along the light sweeps that I'm trying to give this fake metal surface. I think I want to push her contrast just a little bit more, so time to get out the really fine brush to test my skills at fine details, adding white to my last mix to get my color. I layer this up in all the really pointy bits in the middles of my light sweeps, just little light pings where I can get them to give this armor the extreme contrast. And due to the rules, that means I have to find somewhere to put violet on my lust room, which means my Discord friends picked this color as well, they just didn't realize it. With the magenta that's already there, that should be nice and harmonious, and this is going to take some magenta again to get along with the purple, just mixing it till I get a nice in-between with a bit of black and white for opacity. The few places I can think of to put this are the shoulder pads, that are just mushrooms, but they're different enough. The holes in his tail here because they're still the flesh of the tail. The wing caps, but also I feel like these branching veins are a good spot as though they're an equal but different fungal growth. To highlight up the layers, I'm going to do what I did with the green at the very start, adding magenta to my white and use that mix to lighten the previous mix, just so it's always pushing towards that violet side. Adding it to the wings, I want to follow the gradient that's already there, so leave the black of the wing where the shadows are in the dark base and drawing the paint towards the light points. All the other parts just follow my standard highlighting. I'll add more of the magenta white to the last mix of course for my final layer. This time as I paint it along the stalks, I'll focus on the highlights near where they lift up a bit more from the wing and where they fork, since that's where they would catch the most light. For the last few little bits, I gave the Fury's claws some brown and orange, along with some orange glow for his eyes, and small mushrooms around him, which meant that for the Lust Demon, I had to give her blue accents, so a dark blue hair, and really desaturated blue steel sword and necklace. I really like how both of these turned out. I feel like it was a good thing I started with the green on the scales so that overall she could feel more plague, with a few lust colors still in there. While the Mushroom Demon looks wildly different than would be normal, but not at all out of place either. Please subscribe if you like this video, and check the link in the description to my Discord where I talk all sorts of nonsense about miniatures painting, provide critique on paint jobs, and occasionally stream.